My name is Jeff Hall. I am the Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon. Welcome to the faculty, the staff, and the students of Ball State, and a special welcome to our guests. The College of Architecture and Planning is pleased to sponsor this lecture and some exhibitions as we celebrate inaugural week. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce President Blaine A. Brownell, who will deliver the lecture. As a scholar and authority in urban history, Dr. Brownell holds academic rank both in the Department of History and the Department of Urban Planning. And we are honored to publicly welcome him to this building and to this college as a member of the faculty of the College of Architecture and Planning. You have heard, and undoubtedly will hear again more than once this week, of Dr. Brownell's distinguished record of achievement in positions of teaching, research, and academic administrative leadership prior to assuming the presidency of Ball State University. In introducing him this afternoon, I wish to focus solely on his background of education, experience, and scholarship as an urban historian. With an undergraduate degree in American civilization from Washington and Lee University, Dr. Brownell completed both a master's and a PhD in U.S. history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His first academic position was as an assistant professor of history and American studies at Purdue University. He moved on to serve as a senior research fellow at Johns Hopkins Institute of Southern History. While at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, he served successively as chair of the Department of Urban Studies and professor of history and urban studies, director of urban affairs, and Fulbright visiting professor of American Studies and Urban Studies at Hiroshima University in Japan, to be followed by other administrative positions upon his return to Alabama. His contributions to the literature of urban history are extensive. He is co-author or author of 22 book chapters or articles and 7 books, including Urban America, A History, The Urban Nation, 1920 to 1980, Urban America, From Downtown to No Town, The City in Southern History, The Growth of Urban Civilization in the South, and The Urban Ethos in the South, 1920 to 1930. Dr. Brownell served for 13 years as editor of the Journal of Urban History, the leading professional journal in that field, and is now a permanent member of its editorial board. He is a charter member of the Urban History Association. We honor Dr. Brownell this week as we celebrate his inauguration as the 12th president of Ball State University, and we are fortunate today to have this opportunity to hear from him as he shares his scholarship in urban history. His presentation this afternoon is entitled Spatial Dimensions in Urban History. Please join me in welcoming President Blaine A. Brownell.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks to all the faculty and students in this college. It's a real pleasure to be here. There are some advantages to administrative titles, and one advantage is that as a scholar in urban history, I've rarely had this many people show up to hear me speak. So I suppose being president does have a few advantages. This is the most challenging presentation that I've had to make since assuming my appointment at Ball State. And I really mean that. Because this is not a welcome. And like any good president, I can welcome any group to anywhere without knowing exactly why they're there, what they're doing, or how long they're going to be there. And I can report on what I did before the Ways and Means Committee, and I can recite the enrollment statistics and talk about the future of the university, which of course is a tabula rasa, and I can pretty much say whatever I want to about that. But this is the first opportunity that I have had to share with my new colleagues, the fellow members of this faculty, the ideas stemming from my research and writing over the years. So you see, it's challenging because you actually expect something substantive and not merely pleasant. Well, I haven't been substantive for a long time, which is probably why they gave me this job. And so I have not been an active scholar, certainly since the late 80s. And it's been a long time since I had my oral examinations. I was thinking about that the other day in terms of my advisor told me that I would never know more about the literature in my field than I did the day I took my qualifying examinations, and I think he was absolutely right. And that decline has been very precipitous over the last 10 years or so. So in any case, while presidents are not often called upon to be substantive, I'm going to make an effort to do so today. Some of my administrative colleagues are here, and I know why you're here. It's a courtesy, I know that. But you are really here to find out if I know anything. And I'll give you the answer up front. No, I don't know anything, but I used to know something. And that's what I'm going to talk about pretty much this afternoon, kind of how I got here and where I started out and what the journey was like. Also, don't expect, and I really feel terrible about this, any slides or any footnotes. So I violated two principal requirements of both of my faculties. I do have the slides. I'm not sure whether they're in my office or in the basement of Bracken House, but they are there somewhere, and there's a huge number of them, but I simply haven't had time to locate them or organize them in any coherent way. I took pictures literally almost everywhere I went and used those to illustrate my lectures in urban history. But it would require far more time than I had available to get ready for this to do something that would do this audience justice. I can wield footnotes pretty well as too, but that obviously requires original research, and I haven't done that for this paper either. So what you're going to get this afternoon is the most outmoded possible way of teaching, that which we say we are not doing at Ball State, and that is the unmediated talking head. But I will try to make it as entertaining as possible and as informal as possible, and I hope that you won't hesitate to ask questions at any point. Because this, while it's titled a lecture, it's going to be more like it'd be presumptuous to call it an intellectual pilgrimage. It's more like a sort of an academic autobiography. And I can rest pretty well assured that most of you have not spent a lot of time reading everything that I ever wrote. So therefore, this may come as something new to you, even though it's been in print for some time. I also look forward to responding to any questions you may have later on, at least to the best of my ability. When I went to college, I was interested in being either a lawyer or a journalist. Many of you come here knowing exactly that you want to be an architect or had started out in that direction. But in any case, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I was interested in history. I was born and raised in the South. And every Southerner is interested in history, whether they know it or not, or get it right or not. I read all kinds of literature about the war between the states, and you notice I got the title right. But when I got to college, I continued my interest in history, but I developed a new fascination with 20th century United States history, and particularly with the Progressive era. My senior thesis at Washington Lee was on Teddy Roosevelt and the campaign of 1912. And it was a delight for me because I got to go to the Library of Congress and actually work in the Roosevelt papers, and that was the first experience I'd had in working with primary sources of that magnitude. The political history of that event and others was compelling, but it started to dawn on me that what I was really interested in was the history of ideas and how these ideas influenced action and either justified the way people acted or inspired them to act in a certain way. So when I entered the graduate program in U.S. history at the University of North Carolina, I started focusing more and more on the history of ideas, and especially the popular ideas that help shape and explain group action. Now, how in the world did I get to the University of North Carolina? I went there because they were the only ones that offered me any money. And I decided to study history because my advisor helped get me a scholarship. And I was pretty good at it. And I suppose that was about as much direction as I had. So when they say that you have to have a plan for your life very early and follow it precisely, forget it. Because, at least in my case, it never worked very well. My master's thesis at Chapel Hill was written under the direction of George Brown Tyndall, who is one of the great historians of the American South. But it actually grew out of a seminar that I had in the 1920s with Robert Moats Miller, and it was a study of America in the 1920s. And there were about, 8 or 10 of us in this seminar. And what I decided to study, based partly on my reading of the agrarian thinkers in the American South, was the agrarian theories of the 1920s. And I couldn't even give you the bibliography of these now. It's been a long time since I looked at them, but there was actually a pretty rich literature in that decade about the virtues of the family farm. This is deeply embedded, of course, in the history and culture of our country, a typical kind of Jeffersonian approach. But that it took the thing I was really interested in is the farm community movement in the 1920s, because in North Carolina, because what this movement attempted to do was to carry out this agrarian theory, to kind of prove the virtues of a particular way of living. If you will, it was a kind of community building, albeit it was in a rural setting. So in what would come to be a kind of lifelong direction for my work, I was interested in how these popular ideas clustered around agrarianism helped to shape this group action and community building and what people actually did. I mean, they had to purchase property and they had to develop on the ground what they were talking about. The ideas of small-scale economic enterprise, democracy, individual independence, these were all pretty important ideas, obviously, in this agrarian thinking. You could examine these as rhetorical expressions, and of course many people did. And there are books about the Southern agrarians and what they really intended. But I was always interested in actually looking at those individuals that tried to do something based on those ideas, so I could look back on the ideas and see them in that kind of perspective. But what my initial interest was, and probably always really was on the ideas themselves and how they were illuminated by what actually happened. Do communities and the built environment always correspond with the ideas that inspire and explain them? Are these ideas always consistent? Do the popular ideas that we're talking about have the same rigor and consistency as philosophical constructs? Well, the answer is no to all three of those questions. But the actions that people take individually or in groups do cast some essential perspective on these ideas and their role in the larger culture. Now, you can take a cynical approach and say that what people say is irrelevant. What they do is really what they mean. And I think we all know that that's not necessarily true, because you may be a firm believer in a particular notion, but it's very difficult to implement it. So the fact that you don't achieve some sort of perfect realization of an idea doesn't mean that you're any less committed to it. But the point I'm trying to make is that the idea and the action are related, and it's in that interrelationship that I was mostly interested. When I approached my doctoral thesis, I wanted to continue the study of popular ideas in the dissertation. But I decided, the decision about a specific topic just seemed endless. It was the only time in my whole graduate education that I felt kind of at sea and uncertain. And some of you either have been there or will be there, because this is a pretty important decision. Not only has somebody else done it, but since I'm going to spend a year or two or more working on it, and this is going to perhaps stamp the initial part of my professional career, it's got to be right. I can't even recall all the elements in my decision. It was probably a process of elimination, talking to a lot of people. But I did end up with a project that did combine three of my abiding interests. One, of course, was popular ideology, expressed in newspapers and public prints and public festivals and a variety of things like that. The American South, where I was very comfortable in terms of both my heritage and the historical work that had been done on that region, and cities. And somebody asked me many years ago, why were you interested in cities? And it was very hard for me to answer the question because I had this fascination with cities as places where everything seemed accentuated. All the relationships were accentuated. All the good things were even better and all the bad things were even worse. They were like crucibles where you could see things in very close connection and in high relief. And I suppose that all stemmed from a trip I made with my grandmother when I think I was 12 years old on a train from Birmingham, Alabama to New York City. And that left a very deep impression on me, although New York is, of course, in many respects, a very unique and powerfully exciting urban environment. In any case, cities, the American South, and popular ideology. So I was thinking along those lines, and since George Tyndall, who had been my master's advisor, was in Italy on a Fulbright in 1968, I chose as my advisor for the dissertation a new arrival at Carolina from UCLA. He'd actually been Dean of Liberal Arts there, George Maury, who was a very preeminent 20th century U.S. historian, who was the leading authority, ironically, on the Bull Moose movement or the election of 1912 and Teddy Roosevelt. And I had quoted from him extensively in the senior honors thesis, but had never met him before. I became his first student at North Carolina and was later to actually revise one of his books for publication and be listed as its co-author. Now, this was a stressful situation, almost as much as my talking to you today. And because this was a book that was published in a series edited by my postdoctoral advisor, David Herbert Donald, who had won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Daniel Webster. And I had worked under him at Johns Hopkins at a postdoc, and then he went on to a chair at Harvard. So I was doing the work for him. But the work consisted of revising and paring down and, frankly, changing and cutting out a lot of things that were written by my dissertation advisor. So I felt literally between a rock and a hard place through much of this project. Fortunately, George Maury told me, I remember asking him at a convention, I said, George, I'm doing a lot of stuff to your book, and I just really feel uncomfortable about it. He looked at me and he said, Blaine, you get to a certain age and you just don't care that much anymore. Oh, thank God. That was weird. Well, of course, I made sure that he saw everything. And it was a tremendous pleasure to work with these two wonderful historians on this project. In any case, I decided for the dissertation to study the growth and development of southern cities in the 1920s. So I was sticking with the 1920s. And more specifically, I was interested in the ideas about urbanization in those cities. I had been reading some pretty interesting work, which I think is still interesting, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, on the imagery of cities in American literature and popular culture. We all know that we're supposed to be an agrarian nation and that cities were looked upon rather negatively, and yet we contrasted that with the absolutely vital role that cities played even in the development of the American frontier. Kevin Lynch's book was very influential to me, entitled The Image of the City, and that was published in 1960. And he had a later book, which has one of the best titles that I've ever heard of. The title is What Time Is This Place? Beautiful because it brings together these two critical dimensions that can illuminate each other so well. Also, Anselm Strauss's book, Images of the American City, published in 1961, was also very influential. And both of them were influential because they were about the way that people envisioned cities. And without going into too much detail about Lynch's work, what he basically said was that the image of the city, and you could translate this to the environment generally, our own personal image of the city was based around, I think he used nodes and pathways and basically things that we encountered as part of our own personal experience. People ask me, of course, like they would ask you when you're a newcomer, what do you think of Muncie? Based on all this reading I've done, the first thing I say is, well, that part of it that I know I like very much. Because my image of Muncie is based solely on my experience mostly in this particular part of town and on those pathways and nodes that I've connected with. And that is true for all of us, of course, individually. But it's also true in terms of groups of people. And that's what I tried to find out. So I focused on 5 major cities: Atlanta, New Orleans, Birmingham, Memphis, and Nashville, and a couple of minor cities, Charleston and Knoxville. And what I wanted to do was to explore the relationship between the ideas of these cities and patterns of urban development, what was actually taking place in these cities. And I discovered a variety of ideas, and they were connected in a general way with socioeconomic status, which was also connected with particular experiences in the city. I could never do this again, but what I did at the time was to read on microfilm every newspaper, at least major newspaper, and some of the minor newspapers, particularly from the minority community, of these cities throughout the entire decade of the 1920s, and it's a wonder I have any eyesight left at all. And what I was looking for were any editorial comments that had to do with the nature of the city, had to do with other cities, had to do with urbanization in general. I was looking for urban planning information. I was looking for public festivals when the centennial or some anniversary of the city was celebrated. Anything that would elicit a general comment about what was the city all about and how was it connected to other cities. And then at the same time, I was looking at a lot of demographic data, socioeconomic data, and as I got into urban planning, every urban plan that was developed during that period for these cities. Now, the most important such group I discovered in terms of fashioning a coherent idea about the city was what I tried to avoid a hyphenated term, but I simply couldn't avoid it. At least I couldn't think up of anything, and since other people have used this fairly frequently, I guess they couldn't either. The group I termed the commercial civic elite, mostly business-oriented, but also including the heads of civic organizations, ministers, Chamber of Commerce representatives, heads of women's social clubs, not specifically business-oriented, but connected to the business community. Now, this group had a citywide, pretty coherent vision of the urban area. And the kind of city, the model that of city that they described, or at least I described, was corporate expansive. This was a city that was held together tightly by, in a kind of corporate framework, and yet all of these people were dedicated to growth and development in a kind of standard boosteristic mode. And the vision that they had, I termed the urban ethos, with some caveats about using a term that has kind of religious connotations, but I wanted to find a term that conveyed, it was more than an idea, and in some ways more than a concept. So what I discovered was that the breadth and character, or the breadth of ideas about urban communities, tended to conform to the range and character of a group's social and economic interests. The commercial civic elite was committed to the growth and development of the city, but they were also committed to social order, and they were committed, not surprisingly, to the preeminent role of the commercial civic elite. So this concept was directly based on their own urban experience and also on their own direct social and economic interest. Now, this ideology about the city was expressed through newspapers, magazines, civic organizations, events and activities, and through an active boosterism that linked urban identity to urban and social policy. Economic competition was very deeply embedded in the South, and one of the things I discovered was that the South was actually among the nation's leaders in developing this intense urban competition, carving out trade territory. The chambers of commerce in the South were especially active in all these activities. And of course, there was a range of commentary about our trade territory versus their trade territory, and the competition between Birmingham, for example, and Atlanta was very intense and elicited all kinds of self-commentary and commentary about the other city. The ideology was also expressed, not surprisingly, through urban planning. As I wrote then, to show you that I did know something at one time, the kind of city envisioned in the urban ethos could be attained, according to most commercial civic spokesmen, not by changes in institutions or the urban class structure, but by an emphasis on responsible citizenship, social control, and the regulation of the physical city through urban planning. The urban ethos was thus both a means of dealing conceptually with urban reality, of comprehending the city, and also of providing conceptual guidance in the formulation of urban policy. So these ideas were not simply offhanded references to what the city was and might become. It actually did underlay a lot of social policy that guided urban development. Now, urban planning in the 1920s was and is a major topic in its own right in the South and elsewhere, but suffice it to say here that the development of city planning commissions, comprehensive city plans, and the rise of national consultants like Harlan Bartholomew and John Nolan, who did plans throughout the South and in many other parts of the country, provided me with a really rich load of sources for exploring ideas about the city and how these ideas should be expressed in the built environment. And that began my initial interest in the history of city planning. That led to a separate article that I published in the Journal of Urban History in 1975, which focused on the role of city plans in defining very, very well what the corporate expansive city was all about. Now, any of you that have looked at these city plans in the 1920s and 30s know that there were strict zoning controls that separated the city in terms of economic activity as well as ethnic and social class, even though the Supreme Court had banned racial zoning. I think it was 1918. I can't remember the dates anymore, but and yet they were also laid out so that they could very easily grow and develop. A lot of which you wouldn't be surprised to find in communities that were dominated by local business and civic elements. This model was very socially conservative, but it was very dynamic in terms of its economic development. When my book, The Urban Ethos, was published in the same year, 1975, very little had actually been written about cities in the South. I initially selected the South because I had good sources on it, and I was in the area, so to speak. I was mainly interested in the ideas. But the book drew a lot of notoriety because very little had ever been written on the urban South as opposed to the plantation South or the rural South. So the subsequent attention to the book focused a lot on this area. The other thing that I was able to demonstrate is that instead of having a kind of regional defensiveness, although there was some of that, some sort of affirmation of regional peculiarity, some notion that the South was unique and different from everybody else, what I kept running into was the repeated statement that southern cities were basically cities like cities everywhere else. And so if anything, this commercial civic elite was drawing attention to the commonalities between cities in the South and the West and even the Northeast and Midwest. And so what I saw developing was a kind of a much deeper and richer urban consciousness than I think anyone believed existed in the South. There is a whole literature, by the way, that suggests that certain patterns of urban development are unique and different in terms of how open land is used, in terms of the proclivity, even fairly recently, of Southerners to have farm animals in at least some parts of the city. My co-author of the textbook, David Goldfield, kind of takes the unique approach to southern cities, and I take the opposite reaction. And we even gave a paper, we gave two papers opposing each other at a historical conference once, of all places at the Citadel in Charleston, which was a strange environment to do that in. But in any case, these are very, very interesting questions, and obviously you would have to say that to some degree both of us are right. In any case, my interest in city planning led to my related work on the influence of technology in American cities. And obviously one thing is leading to another. I stick with my fascination with ideas, but also picking up on other ways of exploring that. And I was particularly interested in the impact of the motor vehicle on urban form and urban culture, particularly during the 1920s, which was a very formative period for this kind of urban transportation. Among other things, I argued that the impact of new transportation technologies was actually greater in those cities that were in rapid stages of their development at the time the innovations were introduced, which you may already know. But at the time, the idea was that the technology would have the greatest impact on those cities that were already the most advanced. And in some cases, the disruption of the automobile to the older industrial cities in the Northeast and Midwest was indeed greater because they had a much more developed rail transportation system, for example. But in any case, what I argued was that the automobile generally shaped cities in the South and West to a greater degree than it did those in the Northeast and Midwest. And even with the automobile and technology generally, I was still interested in the ideological dimensions, and especially the degree to which the motor vehicle represented concepts like modernity and mobility and individuality, and that it changed social patterns as well as spatial patterns. Some of these we already know in terms of courtship and a variety of other things, but I also explored the relationship in terms of race relations. Because when you were behind the wheel of a car on the open road, there was a degree of equality and individuality there that could not be attained elsewhere, whatever the efficiencies of alternative means of transportation. So I did an essay putting some of these ideas together for the American Quarterly, entitled A Symbol of Modernity, Attitudes Toward the Automobile in Southern Cities in the 1920s. You may also be realizing at this point that very much in an era of publish and perish, I was following the dictum of exploit your research notes to the fullest possible extent. And so I was working on a book, I was working on 2 or 3 different articles at the same time, and while they were overlapping, I hope they weren't actually identical. The problem of the motor car in the city was as much a result of an intellectual crisis, I wrote, as anything else. Just as Southern urbanites failed to fully understand the multifaceted consequences of the motor vehicle in their cities, so they also failed to develop any coherent strategy for dealing with those consequences. In other words, they had not come to terms with the motor vehicle, what it meant, what it was, what its consequences were, and so obviously could not develop a coherent strategy for dealing with it. Now, David Goldfield, with whom I've had a long-standing professional relationship, he's now in Sweden as the Fulbright professor at Uppsala University. We are frequently in contact. In fact, he visited Muncie and stayed with us here in early August. He just got an email message from somebody, I'm not sure where, asking where they could possibly locate a copy of this wonderful textbook that somebody had used in a course, and they were trying to find out where they could get it. Well, unfortunately, it is now out of print. But he and I did work on what became what was at least for a period of 4 or 5 years, the leading textbook in urban history, and it went through 2 editions. The first edition, published in 1979, was called Urban History, and the subtitle, Jeff referred to, From Downtown to No Town. And I remember how clever we thought that was, and just a really nice turn of phrase. And I think we kind of knew what we meant by that. Obviously, it was going from downtown to the suburbs, or what you might call no town. But it elicited all kinds of confusion and turned out actually not to be accurate. So we dropped it in the second version. But it still has a nice ring to it, unless you start to think what it really means. The organizing principle of this book was that all cities existed in space and time, and that their spatial dimensions provided a structure for understanding all the other important things about them. So in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., I think we were attending a conference, not obviously attending many meetings, because we stayed there for a whole day trying to hash out how we were going to organize this book. We decided to define 4 periods of urban history. And these would be defined not just chronologically, but also by the spatial references to the model urban types for each one of those periods. So the colonial town up until about 1790, we termed the cluster. The marketplace was the urban form that dominated the period from 1790 to about 1870. And then with the advent of new transportation technologies, especially the streetcar, the radial center, it's what we call that urban form, prevailed from 1870 to 1920. And then after the advent of the automobile in 1920, we call that urban type the vital fringe. And I remember I even drew these sort of models, sort of based on Chicago School of Sociology theory about how these cities looked. We prepared an introduction to this textbook that relied heavily on the theories of urban geography to explain systems of cities, the relationships between city and hinterland, urban ecology, and different urban forms throughout American history. And this was pretty different stuff for historians. We were essentially bringing in a lot of ideas and concepts from sociology, geography, and ecology, and also architecture and planning. We also included throughout the book references to architecture and the built environment and how these related to urban development and urban life. The basic thing we were trying to convey to students is that use your eyes, use your ears, go into cities today, and you can read that urban environment in a very sophisticated way and figure out exactly what you're looking at and what it means and what the historical depth is behind it. And this is what we wrote in the introduction. More than any other aspect of urban development, the use of space allows us to read cities for the secrets they contain. Behind every suburban enclave or shopping center, every freeway plunging into the central core or ramshackle neighborhood clinging to the railroad tracks lie changing economic realities, political decisions and values, and the efforts of people to succeed or merely to survive. So I don't have time to go into all the dimensions of this, but the way we tried to show this was that the city was like an overlay, and you could put on or peel off various aspects of that overlay, but the central thing that in which the city existed was a spatial framework. Well, the second edition of Urban America, which was published in 1990, dropped the original subtitle and, among other things, added a new and some ways more complex urban form. Interesting what can happen in just the space of a decade. The multi-centered metropolis, which is what we described the urban form that was emerging after the 1970s. This was something, yes, that was influenced by the automobile, but it suggested that, well, as you all well know, that the urban form of today has many centers. The downtown continues to be an important center for the metropolitan area, but is by no means the only center. We also addressed the regional shift from the Frost Belt to the Sun Belt. Remember all the books about the Sun Belt? This is supposed to be a wasteland right now, according to a lot of the projections. I mean, I'm glad it's not. We won't say what happens in Florida and Texas and all the rest of the places. The emphasis on space, the built environment, remained very much a part of that work. Since the number of courses on urban history specifically has declined, unfortunately, this is now subsumed more under economic history, social history. There were not sufficient adoptions for this book, but it's become, as David termed it, a cult classic. And I still have 10 copies, and I'm going to sell them one day for a whole pile of money. Now, only a few years after arriving at my first academic appointment at Purdue, I joined with 3 other young historians to found the Journal of Urban History, the first issue of which appeared in 1974. And as I look back on that, I think, my Lord, how could we do that? Because most of the senior people in the field were really not interested in starting a Journal of Urban History. The idea was that urban history was only a part of social history and that they did not want to fragment the conceptualizations about the city. But being young and knowing everything, we nevertheless forged ahead. Many of our senior colleagues, though they resisted the idea, encouraged us because we were working hard, and we also got a number of them to contribute articles and essays and to serve at least to provide some window dressing, which we were definitely not, for the editorial board. Well, in about 5 years, it was obvious that this was emerging as the leading journal in the field and that it was going to be around for a long time. And as Jeff alluded, I served as editor for 13 years after starting out as associate editor, and I'm now a permanent member of the editorial board. Now, the interesting thing about the Journal of Urban History was it was intended from the beginning to be international and interdisciplinary, which turned out to be a lot easier to say than to accomplish. It's a little bit like multidisciplinary work nowadays. It's a lot easier to describe or to say rather than to put into effect. The first editorial board of 20 scholars did include 2 from England and 1 each from Australia, Canada, France, and Japan. But nevertheless, this was just only a beginning foray into gathering urban historians together under one forum. Our first challenge was the United Kingdom, where disciplinary boundaries were relatively more sacrosanct than in the United States, and where urban history was being pursued largely within the discipline of economic history, which was separated from the rest of history. I think the British, now that I look back on it, looked at these young guys barely in their 30s and concluded that we were a bunch of American cowboys and got a lot of pleasure out of seeing us bound around and do our thing. But we gradually developed professional connections and personal friendships with our colleagues in England. We brought several of them onto the editorial board, and we won them over, and now we have a number of subscribers in England as well as in other parts of the world. And as a result, I was invited to join the board of the History of Planning Group, which was a British enterprise with some overseas members that was centered at the University of Birmingham under the leadership of Gordon Cherry. Again, an illustration of how one thing leads to another and how I got involved in the history of urban planning. Well, soliciting, reviewing, and publishing work covering Europe, Latin America, Asia, just about everywhere was a pretty constant challenge. And as an editor, I certainly made no pretense to understanding all of this, but it was, I felt like an impresario sort of putting on different performances on stage with the assistance of a growing editorial board and review panel. The number of subjects published outside the United States has consistently increased, and the amount of work that's now submitted to the Journal of Urban History is so substantial that the publisher is now bringing out 6 issues a year instead of 4, which I think is one of the few cases where Sage Publications is doing that. We were also able, through the Journal of Urban History, to encourage interdisciplinary work by attracting submissions from sociologists, geographers, ethnographers, even architects. In one of our most popular features, which many people were skeptical about at the time, was a series of interviews with notable urban historians. Now, whatever academics may say, we are all interested in gossip, and we really do all want to know how Professor Tilly got to be the way he was. And so Professor Bruce Stave at the University of Connecticut, who was an associate editor, conducted a number of these interviews, and they were among our most popular features, and he even put them together in a book that was published separately. I always said that it would come time when the journal was shut down, when he got around to interviewing his fellow editors, and he actually did it in the celebration of the 20th anniversary edition, but we didn't shut the journal down. We also published reviews of museum exhibits and motion pictures and photographic exhibits. And now that I look back on it, I think we did a lot of things that were pretty innovative and that some journals are only now beginning to experiment with. One of the outgrowths of the journal was the formation of the Urban History Association. There were about 13 of us gathered in in a hotel room or in a conference room in Reno, Nevada, and decided that we needed this professional association. And that is now going strong as well. And I'm pleased to say that the Urban History Association has agreed to co-sponsor with Ball State a conference next fall on small cities, something that I talked to some of my colleagues about before even coming here. And we'll get the place and the precise time announced later on, but we ought to have a very interesting assemblage of scholars dealing with the particular dynamics of smaller or intermediate-sized cities in Muncie next fall. You may not know this, but there are social scientists around the world who consider Muncie an exotic destination and someplace they have always wanted to come. There is a sociologist from the University of Glasgow in Scotland that is here presumably to attend my inaugural, but he's really here because he always wanted to visit Middletown. He's probably out at Minnetrista right now going through the stuff. Let me tell you a few things about, I mean, you know this already, presumably, but some of the things that I learned about interdisciplinary study, and then maybe some of the projects that I've thought about doing if I ever become a normal person again, and then we can conclude this and have questions if you like. I pretty freely and without apology borrowed ideas from other disciplines. I like to read in a number of different areas, and I talked to friends of mine who were studying other fields, and would just purloin these ideas and incorporate them into my work. That is a very rich and rewarding enterprise, and I hope that you are at least trying to do it. Nothing is more exciting than seeing your subject from a whole different angle. The best description I ever heard of what one of your important roles is as a scholar is that if you are trying to explain something, you have to fashion a lens so that if you can hand that lens to somebody else, and if they look through it, they'll see the same thing you do. In other words, it's not enough to just have the idea. It's absolutely essential that you be able to communicate it in a way that other people understand it, at least many of them, the way you intend them to understand it. And there is no better way to fashion this lens than to bring in a number of different perspectives so that you can triangulate an idea or a subject or illuminate it from different angles. The problem with that, though, is that theories and insights in other disciplines obviously exist within a multi-layered context that may or may not be apparent to an enthusiastic interloper from across the way. And I was always aware, and maybe more aware now than I was then, of the fact that just picking and choosing from all these various ideas, what was I leaving behind? What was I failing to understand about this particular concept? So it's a very difficult balance. On the one hand, I think one of the most severe problems in all scholarship today is that we are unable to communicate with a larger audience. We're not even able to communicate across sometimes departments in our own school or college, and that this is a very severe disadvantage. And so we have to somehow make it possible to communicate in this broader sense. We don't have to be public intellectuals in order to do this necessarily, but I think the communication dimension is very important. On the other hand, disciplines do evolve out of an enormous amount of work and literature that simply cannot be easily mastered unless you were, in a sense, brought up in that discipline. So in any case, I think you have to respect the fact that you may be missing something, but what you're trying to do is illuminate something that you're particularly interested in the context of your discipline. And if there's any theory or any insight that you can find that helps you do that, I think that's worth all the risk you may be taking. Now, future interests. I've always assumed that someday I would return to full-time faculty duty. I probably underestimate how difficult that would be, but when the time comes, I'll do it. In the basement of Bracken House, there are several boxes of research notes, documents, photographs that I've accumulated from several years of research into cities across the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast and in between, for work I was contemplating a single work on the impact of the automobile in all of its dimensions on American cities and culture in the early part of the 20th century. I'd love to do that someday. It'll really be like an archaeological expedition if I ever get into all that stuff, but it is available. And if I can't do it, I promise you I will find some good graduate student and save them a lot of time by handing all this information over. I was also interested and never got around to really doing anything with the responses to various natural disasters in communities, mostly cities, but it could be other kinds of communities. In other words, what happens when something comes along to kind of wipe out the current spatial arrangements and built environment? What happens? You have a clean slate, a tabula rasa. You have an opportunity to create something bigger and better, to refine what you were doing before, to find new ways of doing things, to cope with all the problems that in the old urban environment. But what we typically discover, at least in this country, is that when such a thing happens, we rush as quickly as possible to rebuild the environment pretty much the way it was before. And I think a lot of that is driven by the demands of commerce. The desire that we don't have time to sit around and do some sort of social analysis of what's going on. We got to get businesses functioning again. We got to get people employed. We got to get all the infrastructure of transportation and healthcare and all the education, all that stuff back in place. In some cases, though, there was some thought given to how a city could be improved or developed. In any case, again, there are ideas here. And you can really say that if a city is given the opportunity to rebuild in a new and different way and decides not to, then that pretty much has to convey the fact that at least those that make those decisions are not unreasonably unhappy with the way things currently are arranged. When I went to Hiroshima University, I was a lecturer and was teaching 4 classes. That sounds terrible, except they met 1 hour per week. So I was really not terribly overburdened. But students took 16 different courses. Well, anyway, that's a whole other subject. But I had a small research project. The research project was the rebuilding of the city of Hiroshima after, of course, the bomb, which turned it into a tabula rasa big time. And one of the things that Hiroshima did was to build 100-meter dori, or streets, that laced the entire community so that all the major thoroughfares were at least 100 meters wide. And I thought this was amazing because the Japanese were anticipating the need for motorized vehicles and motorized transit in a way that we had not really come to realize at that point in the United States, even about the 1940s. And what I discovered, I'll never forget, didn't have anything to do with the automobile. What the Japanese were doing was trying to cope with one of the most ancient urban scourges in Japan, and that was fire. Japanese buildings traditionally made out of wood, even though almost all the buildings in Hiroshima, Japan now are made out of cinder blocks and concrete and brick. And they weren't trying to avoid an event like the atomic bomb, because the atomic bomb would have obliterated everything. What they were really concerned about was building streets that would act as fire breaks. An interesting insight about what was going through their minds as they tried to lay out the new city following this unnatural disaster, if you want to call it that. Well, in any event, that's where what I used to know, what I would like to know in the future, if I ever have a chance to pursue it. And whenever you guys determine that I'm more useful to Ball State by pursuing these projects than by sitting in the president's office, you just let me know, because I can guarantee you I do have some things to do. But in the meantime, I'll be happy to leave the teaching and the scholarship and the slides and the footnotes to you. Thanks very much for listening. Any questions? I'd be happy to try to respond.
Time for a few questions, if there are any. Parker?
In going back to your 1920s southern cities, were there any people that you found who were articulating or effectively articulating an alternate vision as opposed to the corporate dominant vision?
There were, one of the deficiencies of the kind of research method that I was using was I was relying primarily on public prints or on things that would be included in the public prints. I did write about the fact that the average person who got up in the morning and went to work and had primarily to worry about their kids and had a salaried job or worked in a factory or a mine, these individuals are not really concerned about the corporate expansive city and a lot of the other issues that this other group is concerned about. But they were mainly involved in fact, the only image or idea they had of the city was simply the part of it in which they lived. You would get labor unions and others to the extent that those existed in the South at that time, and actually in Alabama they did exist, would talk about the needs of those communities. I did look at some material on company towns and the injustices that often took place there. But these really rarely didn't get to the level of a commentary on cities. I looked at every black newspaper that I could find, and as you might suspect, there was a lot in those publications about the problems that African Americans encountered in terms of their daily living and so forth. But what was very interesting to me was that in almost all of these, you found this corporate expansive kind of urban ethos replicated. Because many of these papers were, of course, published by people who had business interests in what was the black community. And this was a group of people, a commercial civic elite, if you will, in the black community that was pretty much decimated with the integration movement because their livelihood was based on serving a specific clientele that couldn't get served anywhere else. That's a whole other story. But you would find certain comments in those prints about the fact that certain benefits were not made available to African Americans. And you also found some commentary about the urban migration to the north. And in a sense, I mean, these were people who were leaving the South for the North, but usually it was portrayed as a desire to have greater economic opportunity. And these cities, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast, represented for Southern blacks, most of whom who moved first to the cities before they moved here. These cities, the northern, eastern, Midwestern cities, represented a kind of a promised land for a lot of these migrants. Many of them, not surprisingly, were a little disappointed, just like many immigrants who expected the streets to be paved with gold found they were not. But there wasn't a very well-articulated alternative concept at the time. Yes?
Would you characterize the corporate expansive city as a distinctively sort of American phenomenon? In other words, would a European city of approximately the same size be based on essentially different ethos?
Without having obviously conducted elaborate research or really any meaningful research in Europe, I couldn't comment precisely, but I can, yes, I think you're right. There was very much an American economic development tone to this ethos. The idea that everyone is going to benefit if there were more manufacturing jobs added and so forth. It was in Birmingham, where I grew up, there was always a kind of anecdotal belief that the leadership, the corporate expansive leadership in Birmingham, resisted the intrusion of any other economic enterprises. So in a sense, they were keeping growth down because they wanted to keep their own control of the local area, particularly the mines and the mills. But I could find absolutely no evidence of that. I mean, it may have been true subconsciously, but they seem to be just as interested in growing and developing and competing with Nashville and Atlanta than anybody else. Boosterism is very much present in a lot of the literature of the 1920s. You can see it in almost any local paper. What surprised me is the extent to which it was even more developed in the country's least developed economic region than it was in some other places. But I think there was a very American cultural cast to this. Now, this is not to say that Europe later on didn't develop some of the same characteristics. In fact, it's kind of shocking to visit these charming European towns now and see all the suburban development and the damage that the automobile has kind of wreaked on that urban environment. Yes?
Have you found the work in urban geography useful, especially the morphogenetic work that David Vance has done and Conklin has done in Europe? Does that connect to your studies of urban history?
Yes, I read a lot of the work in urban geography, and I'm sure I'm like many of you that started to pursue this work. If you had geography in the 8th grade like I did, it was pasting, cotton balls on a map of Egypt or something. And I just thought geography was learning where stuff was, and I had no idea about the richness of this field as an intellectual endeavor, and it's come as a real disappointment that so many universities have eliminated departments of geography. And there were David Ward, who's the retiring chancellor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I've known for years. And David is an urban geographer who's published some excellent work. Like me, he used to know something, and maybe he still does today. And David is British, like so many of the other geographers who come out of that tradition. I was particularly interested in the geographers that tied together social ethics and social theory with geography, to look at urban space as a commodity, if you will, a resource, and how this resource was overly dominated by privileged groups. And if you look at where people are located, who's located close to the railroad tracks, who's located up on the hill, well, there's a pretty straight correlation with socioeconomic class and political power. And so there's a wonderful Marxist literature that at least theoretically, that exists in that geography literature that I used as well. Again, I just borrowed shamelessly and probably thoughtlessly from a lot of what they did. But I'm still here, so you're free to do it. Yes.
Would you comment on what UAB did to get rid of urban blight in Birmingham?
Yes, Fred. Fred knows a lot about UAB, particularly in the years prior to when I got there. University of Alabama at Birmingham was built, I think it was on like a 70 square block area, pretty much on an area just north of downtown. It was a single urban renewal project. I was told, at least, and I think this may still be true, that it was the only project that was ever done without any local protest at all. And it was it's kind of a shame in a way, because there are occasional. In fact, my office used to be in the old former Ullman School building, which is still a building on the UAB campus. This community was largely a black community. There were institutions, there were street corners that people had gathered on for years. It was a rich social fabric. But this community came together and had to ask itself, is it worth the sacrifice for us to leave this community, to lose this community, to be relocated elsewhere, in order for the educational opportunities that will be available to us with this university here? And I'm sure it didn't happen in that orderly a fashion, but essentially the leadership of that community did agree not to protest and sue and hold the thing up in court. I remember in the 70s kind of asking whether they had gotten a fair shake in this transaction. But since I think the African-American enrollment at UAB now is probably close to 25%, you'd have to say that there was some benefit that extended to it. Is that what you meant? But it was a major project, and it did provide the space for this institution to grow, and without that, it would be very difficult to do that. urban renewal is a whole other wonderful thing to look at. Not that it was wonderful, because in many cases it was really tragic, but if you look at the ideas that were behind it, it just says an awful lot about where our values were, what we were trying to accomplish, what we were overlooking, and would come to appreciate a little more later on. So what we do actually does have something to do with what we think. Was there another question?
Take time for one more question.
Yes.
In your review of the Southern literature points, did you pick up any sense of warning trend of the coming depression, or were there any indicators from editorials in the South of the stock market crash and other happening?
No. You could probably find, just like you have been able to find in our economic surge here over the last 10 years, some doomsayers and people that are talking about problems ahead. The people that have been saying that this economic surge is going to collapse, they're going to be right. They really are going to be right. We'll just have to wait a little longer for them to be right. But basically it was very reflective of the same temper that existed throughout the country in the 1920s. The economic boom, kind of being really mesmerized with the economic boom, with economic development and growth. And I think the stock market crash in 1929 was as much a trauma because how much it surprised people, how much it caused people to lose faith in their idea of how the world worked, as it was simply the fact that they lost their jobs, because suddenly everybody was cast adrift in terms of their relationship to their environment. But I didn't detect anything in the South. The South was still a very poor region, dominated in the rural areas by sharecropping and by a lot of social injustice. And President Roosevelt, you'll remember, identified the South as the nation's #1 economic problem early on in the Depression, and that's how so many of the New Deal programs focused on infrastructure in the South, and so much of the CCC work was in the South. Thank you all so much again. This has been great. I enjoyed it.